Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. I'm Gene Paranak. Today is the 72nd episode of this show that we have been doing. We're so glad you are here. We are so glad also to be talking this month about manufacturing. It's an important topic and something that companies don't often think about until they get to the point where they think they'd like to go to a manufacturer and then they discover that they weren't ready. So what we're trying to do in August is inoculate startups and their partners against some of the common mistakes. And today is going to be our final installment in that. But first, we're going to do the COVID news, COVID Connect. After that, Chris Zandstra from Rose Medical, a top-notch catheter and cannula and related items manufacturer in the great state of Michigan, is going to be joining us. After that, we'll have time for Q&A and community announcements like we always do. So without further ado, let's go into the COVID news. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the local news first. We're going to tell you about the pitch party, the $2,500 quarterly MedTech Crossroads pitch party. It's not really a competition because all the companies are not in the same verticals, but what we want to do is have these companies talk to us about their ideas. Our panel of community judges will judge them on their core merits, and at the end, tip their hat to one of those startups, which will receive $2,500 from Into Being. Of course, Into Being recuses itself from the judging. Here's the plan then. Each startup gets 10 minutes in the month of September to pitch. The decks can be sent to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org to be eligible for selection. Make sure the PowerPoint has the areas of problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and your ask. And any US-based medtech startup is eligible for consideration. Doesn't have to be in a specific area, just has to relate to making people's lives better through medical technology. Our judges, Andy Rader, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, Jim Metzger, and Stacy Frankovich, all raring to go for the last show in September, where they will reflect on what they've heard during the pitches and give us some things to think about, as well as the competitors. So we're looking forward to all of September and to that last show in September, especially where we hear from our judges. Well, let's talk about COVID metrics and vaccine distribution. And I think it goes without saying, but I just want to say it once again today to anyone who is suffering with the disease or loved ones. We extend our hearts and our sympathies. This has been going on for far too long. And just want to take a moment and pause and extend our condolences to anyone going through the worst variations of this at the moment. Sometimes we lose that in the statistics. But here's the picture of community transmission in the United States. It is at the highest level that CDC records, back to levels that we saw at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. Pretty much everything is red at this point. And it's transmitting in every state of the union. Here's Michigan, redder than it was last week. Community transmission level is high, entering this, what appears to be sort of a third wave for the state of Michigan. And this, you may have heard about hospitals being filled up. I think it bears repeating and has been said before by doctors and hospital folks on our show that hospitals have to run about 80% capacity to stay viable, to stay profitable. That means for every 100 beds in a hospital, about 80 of those need to be filled. So when we see that there's 20 COVID admissions per 100 beds, that's enough to fill a hospital up. I think sometimes there's a disconnect in people's understanding. But all those red counties, what we're kind of saying there is they're basically filled the last 20 beds in their hospital because the first 80 per 100 were already filled, because that's what a hospital has to do to run. And so that's why this is of concern, because we're filling up those last beds in the hospital and creating an issue for the ones that may come in after that. So that's why that number matters. New cases are coming up. This is again the state of Michigan, coming up not to the levels we've seen before, but it is a little bit early. Testing is starting to increase, but interestingly, the positivity rate, well, we'll see where that goes. It may be leveling off or it may be climbing. It is up. Deaths, thankfully, still very low, but are increasing. You can see that that curve is coming up somewhat rapidly. We'll see where that goes to. And in terms of hospital admissions coming up like the first two peaks in the state of Michigan, maybe not at the same slope as before. So we'll have to see. That would be some good news if it indeed is a lower slope there. But nevertheless, hospital admissions coming up. The daily national count of vaccine doses administered has upticked slightly since the beginning of July, where it hit a low, but it's not coming up very quickly. And this interesting graphic from CDC for the state of Michigan, and of course, this correlates with some of the issues that we've seen with the vaccine not doing everything it was hoped for, but still doing some good things. For the Delta variant, you're seeing a lot of counties in the state of Michigan where despite higher vaccination rates, you're still getting a lot of cases. Really, it's all over the map here. Not a lot of correlation. And that brings us to this preprint study from medRxiv coming out of Israel. We have often noted that the nation of Israel has done an outstanding job both of vaccinating their population and also of reporting cold hard facts data from that. And this coming out of Tel Aviv, this preprint article from medRxiv, what they are finding is pretty much what we had always been told before COVID happened. And then there was hope that no, the vaccine will be better than natural immunity. But in fact, with this 70 to 80,000 person study, what they are finding, and this nice graphic put together by unheard.com, without time constraints, that is from March of 2020 through February of 2021, infections, the likelihood of infection among double vaccinated, that is with Pfizer, versus those who were previously infected with COVID during that time period from March of 2020 to February of 2021, anyone who could have gotten infected after that, you're about 6 times more likely to get infected this year if you are vaccinated than if you were infected. The likelihood of symptomatic infection among the double vaccinated with Pfizer versus those previously infected, about 7 times higher. That difference between those two probably is reflected, the authors say, in the lack of traceability of many, many unsymptomatic infections, which wouldn't have been caught. So those numbers may in fact be very similar to each other, but you're not seeing it for those who were not symptomatic. If you tighten that window, those who were infected between January and February of 2021 versus those who received the vaccine, the numbers are actually quite a bit different. The likelihood of infection among the vaccinated is 13 times higher than among those who were previously infected in that relatively narrow time window. And the likelihood of symptomatic infection, 27 times higher. This may seem like a bombshell. It really is exactly what doctors and scientists were telling us from the outset. Everyone was hoping the reality would be different. It's important to note that the study goes on to say that those who have gotten COVID and then gotten a single dose of a vaccine are even more protected than those who were just infected or just vaccinated. So again, not really shocking news, but now we're starting to see these numbers coming out of Israel, where a massive amount of the population is vaccinated, and they've got the numbers to do these kind of retrospective studies. So really interesting science coming out of the nation of Israel. With that, we'll pause briefly there in case there's any questions that arise from our audience. We're going to do a just check in here. Not seeing any. I want to tell you that we in August are doing Manufacturing Month. Like I mentioned at the outset, manufacturing is often overlooked. There are so many great manufacturers out there that companies will think to themselves, yeah, I just got to go get a manufacturer. I've got this idea, I've got this napkin sketch, I can go get this built. And of course, the reality is often very different. There are regulatory hurdles, which we often talk about on the show. One of the things that's near and dear to our hearts that have to be gone through, but there are also design for manufacturing, design for manufacturability issues. You can't just toss something over the wall and hope that it's going to hit your viability targets, your cost targets, the functionality, and so forth. So the question for each of the startups and their mentors and their funders is, are you ready for manufacturing? Or is there more development and design that has to be done? If you hear anything like this, the vendor says, we're just not going to quote that for you. Well, you probably weren't ready for manufacturing. Or maybe you did get into production, but you had to stop really soon after starting. You probably weren't ready for manufacturing at that point. Here's one that's often hidden, but happens from time to time. The design engineers are being regularly called to the shop floor to work on the product that's going out the door. That's an indication that DFM hadn't really happened, or some issue with the functionality of the product hadn't really gotten addressed before you went to manufacturing. Or maybe the COGS, the cost of goods sold, is higher than expected. That's another way that you can see that maybe I didn't get everything out. Of course, there are times where getting the cost out is something that happens later in the process, not earlier. But these and more can be indicators that maybe we weren't ready to jump in right away. And we've had some great conversations in the preceding weeks. This week, I am really excited to welcome Chris Zandstra from Rose Medical to the show. Chris is the Director of Engineering with Rose Medical and joins us today. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Gene. Good to be here.
We're really excited to have you because Rose does some really cool stuff with catheters and cannulas and more. I'm going to let you tell us all about it. But there are some interesting nuances when you get to these long extruded products that have to fit into very small spaces in the human body.
Sure.
Different from things we've talked about in previous weeks where it's been like, oh, I'm going to mold this microfluidic plastic part, or oh, I'm going to put this big electromechanical assembly together.
Yeah.
So in just a second, I'm going to welcome you to tell us a little bit more about yourself. But before I do that, I want to welcome Adrian Harris, one of our project managers, our Director of Regulatory Affairs, and one of our business managers to the show. Adrian joins us. Adrian.
Hello, good afternoon.
And Adrian's had the opportunity on many occasions to work with Rose. So I know she's got all sorts of fun tidbits to talk as we get to the DFM portion of today's discussion. So thanks for joining us, Adrian. So Chris, tell us a little bit more about how you got to do what you do with Rose. Everyone's got a story and a passion. I know you've been with Rose for a long time. There must be some passion there that keeps you doing what you're doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question to kind of lead into Rose. So my history with Rose actually started all the way back when I was still in school at Calvin here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And at the time, got connected with a very small medical device manufacturing company that hadn't been around for very long yet. There were only about 20 of us employees and, one clean room and sitting at a small little desk, just trying to come up with some new projects to work on. Ironically, at the time, Adrian and I worked together when she was working with another company and on one of her first projects as well. So we knew each other in a previous life. And it just became an awesome place that I could learn from a lot of our executive management team, who were all guys that had a lot of experience in med device. They had all worked at Medtronic in the cardiovascular division for a long time and kind of cut their teeth there and learned quite a bit, and then wanted to transfer that into kind of their own vision for a company that was just excellent at catheter manufacturing.
Well, that's awesome. And it sounds like the opportunity there has continued and you've stayed because you've had the ability to affect these things. I know you told me when we were chatting before that you've sort of taken this oversight role, Director of Engineering. So you are getting to see a lot of these kind of things that we're talking about today, where an issue comes up and you're gonna have to address it, and you get to get into the weeds on that. Tell us more about Rose. I want to make sure that everyone, some people are coming here and they say, yeah, I know who Rose is. And some people are saying, I don't have a clue. I don't even know what a catheter is.
Sure.
Take us back a step here and tell us maybe for the next 10 or 15 minutes about Rose.
Sure. Yeah, let me, I've got a presentation here I can just kind of pop into a little bit. And so this is front of our building. Obviously, we're in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're a contract manufacturer, so right into that niche that you were kind of talking about, we're getting into manufacturing here, and everything that we do is medical. So we're only working on devices that are typically used in a surgical suite at some point. We do work on some class 1 devices as well, but a lot of it is some sort of open heart or non-invasive surgery. We've got a bunch of clean rooms that we do manufacturing in our facility, and it's been continuing to grow over the time. We've kind of grown. We ended up, about 5 years ago, purchasing the building next to us and growing, kind of connecting it together and growing into that. And we're already talking about growing into another phase at some point here. So it's been a lot of fun watching us grow. And now we're up, about 4x from when I started with Rose, where we've grown significantly over the years and up to about 85 employees. So, and we are located just north of downtown Grand Rapids. I like to talk about the strategic advantages that Rose has as far as manufacturing goes. And I'll actually start at the bottom here, is that we're just a very engineering driven company. It's kind of been ingrained into our DNA from the beginning. Almost the entire executive management team is somebody that comes from an engineering background. So we approach things from a very technical standpoint and tend to analyze it with that background. And I'm in charge of our project engineering group, which really handles project management, new project quotations, all the way through prototyping and into full-scale manufacturing. I actually share a wall with our director of manufacturing engineering, and he is in charge of a whole kind of separate, almost silent part of our company that isn't seen as much, which is really just dedicated to machine building. So it's really a strategic advantage for us. That's how we started, is as a machine builder, and we kind of morphed that into a manufacturing company that now builds machines for itself. So a lot of the equipment that you'll see if you go into our clean rooms is stuff that we've designed and built, knowing how the machines need to function in order to make high quality products. So the controls that we need in order to make good product in a fast time frame on a consistent basis. So that's really, I think, a big thing for us. And I will also say that we have a complete focus on manufacturing. We've partnered with you guys in the past just because we don't really have any desire to get into the design side of things. So we are completely focused on how do we build these things. A lot of customers appreciate it simply because we don't ever have to worry about competing in the same space and designing a catheter that would be similar to something that they want to make. But we just kind of eat and sleep and breathe manufacturing. That's all we have really ever wanted to do. So you touched on this, but basically what we are is we're a catheter manufacturer at the end of the day. We want to be a company that is making catheters from start to finish. We do some component manufacturing in there, but we really want to be making fully assembled devices and packaging them and basically having them ready to go for sterilization. So we like to pull all of our different capabilities together, and we really shine when we are doing all of these things at once. So not just, tipping or hole punching or whatever it is, but really bringing it all together. Anytime we can vertically integrate all of our capabilities and do it all into one device is where we really do our best work. So you can see a couple of cannula that we've made here in the past, and yeah, we like to be taking those all the way through to packaging and buying off the shelf stuff and kitting it so that it's ready to go for our customers, and they're basically receiving sterilized, ready to go product from sterilizers. Within that manufacturing, we've got a lot of different specializations, and these are things that I think we really started as more of a component company, and we just kept growing all these different specializations to a point where it became a natural extension to put them together and make a full catheter package for somebody. So tipping was really the first one, and most companies, when they think of tipping, think of dilators is really a big area where you see tipping. And so we designed our own tipping machines. We've got a whole bunch of them in our clean rooms. We got our biggest clean room is stock full of tipping machines that we have designed ourselves, and they have controls on them that we know we need in order to make parts, and it allows us to do a lot of unique things. And on top of that, since we designed that equipment, we also know how to design the machining pieces for each individual dilator. So if somebody comes to us with a design, we can very quickly and easily say, yes, we can design a tipping die to go into one of our tipping machines, and we know exactly how to make it for you. And so that's been a great thing for us. You can see a bunch of different examples here of some kind of cool tips that we've made over the years. A lot of this stuff is designed to be used over a guide wire. So it'll be about 40 thousandths of an inch inner diameter at the end of the tip. Some of them are very long. We've made some parts that are like 32 French dialators. So they're very large, about 3/8 of an inch. And then they're coming down to, you can see in the bottom corner there, the size of a paper clip basically. So it's 3-inch long tip that's gradually tapering down. Can be very challenging to make, but it's something we've gotten very good at over the years. We've also been able to make some really kind of unique mating geometries, like what you can see in the top right there. It mates up well with another part. And then in the bottom left, you'll actually see a spiral tip dilator, which doctors have been using for echolocation. So they can actually, when they're doing non-invasive surgeries, they can locate that tip within the patient's anatomy without having to actually see it. So that's been a really kind of neat dilator technology that's kind of we've seen spread around quite a bit in the last 5 years or so.
Chris, I think just in terms of the importance of this tipping, I want to make sure that our audience understands it, because it's not something that most people stop and think about. Most of these catheters, they're made from an extrusion, right? You've extruded some kind of tubing out. Maybe it's a single hole down the middle, maybe it's multiple holes down the middle.
Yep.
But what do you do at the end, right? That's what we're talking about here. Is the tipping is what does the end of this thing look like? That's usually where the function is happening. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to even back it up a step further is, you're starting with basically a piece of tube. It may, all different materials, typically thermoplastics, because we're melting and moving material here. So it's got to be something that we can melt and move. And then we're moving it down to what they're looking for is an atraumatic tip. So something that is soft, that when it actually comes into contact with the anatomy is not going to have like a blunt, if you take a tube and you try to push it in, it's going to basically hit a wall. But if you have that long taper, it's atraumatic. It can follow a guide wire easily. It, just kind of basically pushes and dilates with doing minimal damage. So, moving on, flaring is kind of a natural extension. This is the opposite end of the device, right? So tipping, we're talking about really the business end. Flaring is usually more to do with a mating feature of some kind on the back end of the device. So something that potentially the doctor is grabbing onto or using as a handle, or is maybe mating with another portion of the device at some point. Again, we have machines that are designed just to do this in-house. And we have our own in-house fabrication design of those tools. You can see a few different examples here. The ones that are on the left is, again, it's kind of it's basically a glorified handle piece. And then all different sorts of moving plastic, basically into different shapes for mating or with other components, or for handles for doctors to be using in a surgical suite. Dip molding is kind of a unique operation that we do. That's another one that we like to talk about. A lot of times when you talk about dip molding, people think about balloons. So some sort of compliant soft balloon that goes on the device and inflates into some sort of anatomy at some point. And we do that. We've also been seeing a lot more requests lately for soft dip coatings on stents and wire structures and things like that, as those become more and more popular, or laser cut hypotubes, things like that. And so dip molding is really kind of coming back in those regards. We do this in both silicone and polyurethane. We've seen quite a bit of demand for both of those things. Those two things have each one has its own unique advantages depending on what you need. And we've had a lot of customers who are like, I want to try both. I don't know which one will work. And that's, it's actually relatively simple for us to try both options for somebody and provide them with samples of a couple of different materials to see what works. But typically here you're talking about a very soft material. It's not a stent balloon, which is kind of rigid and compliant. It's something that will, or excuse me, rigid and non-compliant. It's something that will kind of take the shape of whatever it's inflated into. And then, yeah, you can see these are a couple of balloons that we've dip molded in the past. One of them is actually mounted onto the end of a cannula there. So that's a multi-lumen cannula. We do some hole punching, we dip mold that balloon, we tip the end of it, you know, kind of like I talked about, marrying some of those capabilities together there. Injection molding is another area that has really become more and more important for us. There's a lot of companies that do injection molding, and we kind of picked it up as a natural extension of all the work we were already doing. Thermoplastic overmolding is one thing here. So we're not really getting into a space right now where we're doing shoot and ship components, but we are interested in doing overmolding onto devices where we can add value to other parts. So if we're tip molding something and somebody wants a dilator handle overmolded, we'll take that on. We've currently got an Arberg machine in our clean room for doing thermoplastic overmolding. We've got another one on order, so that business is growing. And we've also been doing quite a bit of silicone molding. So, and that's both molding and overmolding in that case. And yeah, they're very different animals, but we've got guys who are very good at both of them. And our strategy has been to really help customers understand and work through prototyping, and then bridging into that early phase of manufacturing and then growing into full-scale production tooling as well. So you can see, yeah, again, pictures, a couple of examples here of both some silicone molding and some thermoplastic molding. The picture on the right there is actually a pretty large diameter silicone wire reinforced tube. So that's about a 1-inch diameter part, which is very large whenever you're talking about medical device. And we mold that tip onto the end of that part. It acts as kind of a seal over another mating piece on the inner diameter. And then in the bottom corner there, you can see that's a 3-lumen, you know, it's got 3 different holes in it, wire reinforced silicone part, and we've molded a connector onto the back that you can actually access each of the lumens through some sort of lure connector or something like that. So it's a simplified version of an RCSP cannula, if you're familiar with those. Wire reinforcement is another area where we have a lot of expertise. We've got both thermoplastic and silicone. So this is, you know, a lot of people are familiar with this. You're talking about a PTFE liner with a braid or a coil inside, maybe some marker bands. You can have all different thermoplastic outer layers when you're dealing with this. So you might have a stiffer region and a softer region that needs to flex more. This is an area that we've grown a lot in. And we do, as I said, also do this in the silicone world. They're very different processes doing wire reinforcement in silicone and in thermoplastic. We actually started in the silicone realm, which is much less common. There's not a lot of companies that do silicone wire reinforcement. There's a lot more that do thermoplastic wire reinforcement, but we do have the capability to do both and are doing both in a production setting. Another one is laser marking that we've got into quite a bit. I think that a lot of companies are starting to move this way with their production when it comes to doing things like artwork, depth marks and things like that on cannulas and catheters. We've been doing pad printing for a really long time. We do it on a lot of different types of devices. It's effective. It's also very messy, and it's challenging to do tight tolerances on. We certainly do it a lot of places, but we see a lot of companies moving towards laser marking. Obviously, adhesion is less of an issue. You're not really sticking anything to a catheter when you're laser marking it. You're more, you know, basically burning the surface, for lack of a better term. This also offers some advantages as far as lower upfront tooling costs. So, you know, the laser is a piece of equipment that we own. If you want to try 3 different types of artwork and you want to do that with pad printing, I have to go buy 3 different pad printing cliches, and that can be expensive. If you want to do that with laser marking, I can have somebody program it in about 5 minutes, and we can shoot 3 parts and we can get that to you very fast. So we're seeing a lot of companies moving toward that when they can. It's a fantastic in terms of quality, in terms of ability to have a very sharp mark. Sometimes with pad printing throughout a run, you'll see variations in clarity, but everything looks very sharp. The only downside is it's kind of the Henry Ford motto. You can have it in any color as you want, as long as it's gray. You get, so yeah, it kind of is what it is there. We have had customers ask us if we can laser mark in blue, and it's, no, unfortunately we can't. It's kind of the physics of it, but it is a great solution. The last one that I'll touch on is PTFE processing. I think this has really been a place that med device and cannula are going and are continuing to go, is more and more, where can I use PTFE in my device? It was originally for lubricity, but I think people are really starting to use it more and more for the toughness of the material and what it can withstand. And as we play with this material more and more, we get better and better at finding ways to form it and shape it. That was the major drawback for a long time, is it's not the same type of thermoplastic as other materials. So how do you get it into a tip form or a flare or some other geometry? What does that look like? Since it's not lubricious, nothing sticks to it, and you can't mold it together with other uncommon materials. But we've been working with a lot of companies on finding, ways to make parts out of PTFE, and I think it's going to be a place people continue to grow into. So that's my highlight on Rose for you there, Gene.
That's awesome, Chris. We really appreciate you taking us through that. And some of those things that you highlighted, I think it's important for the audience to recognize how much research and development goes into developing these manufacturing techniques, right? I remember, like you mentioned, laser marking. I remember a project that we worked on, it wasn't with you guys, but we ended up laser marking something, and then suddenly the biocompatibility went south on it because of how the laser marking ended up getting done. And you had to, gotta correct that. So something as seemingly simple as that, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Or PTFE, I mean, if anyone's ever tried to process PTFE, it's a really, really hard thing to do. And it takes time and effort to make those happen. And so like when we as designers, we have to know what's possible. And you guys are establishing, in many of these cases, what is possible and what you can do with reliability. So there's a lot of value to that that's important for people to recognize. I thought as we branched into this next question I wanted to talk about today, which is design for manufacturability. And on the show in previous weeks, we've talked about other types of parts, other types of devices. I'm reminded that you said earlier, Chris, how you guys like to focus on the manufacturing. You don't like to do the development end. That's been a great place for just informal relationship between Being and Rose. And I remember there was a project, names and places to protect the innocent, but there was a project that I remember the client had brought to the company, to Rose. And it was sort of you don't have a design package. So we're not even talking about design for manufacturability at this point. We're talking, there wasn't a design package. And I remember, Adrian, this was a case where you threw together a design package and you went back to Rose and boom, suddenly the language was being spoken. The language of manufacturing was being spoken in representation in this design package. And so maybe this question is actually a little bit more for Adrian. This is before we get into design for manufacturability. Like, did we figure all the things out and how they're going to be manufactured? There's something even more basic before that I think is worth touching on, which is like, what is even a design package that goes to a manufacturer like Rose? What is it? What does it consist of? What kinds of things do we as developers sometimes we understand the manufacturing parameters and sometimes we don't fully, and it's up to Rose to tell us. What are some of the basics that have to go out the door before a true manufacturer is ready to really look at this?
I was going to actually pose that question to Chris, but I'll give you some insight
Excellent.
from my side as a designer. Trying to pull from examples, there's times where you want a certain material. You might only know you want a silicone or you want a urethane, or there's times where you want a soft material. And in one of the more complicated projects that I've worked with Rose on, we had a really, really technical, complicated design. And we knew that we needed a flexible material, but it took a lot of interactions and a lot of Rose bringing their material expertise to the table to help us actually pick the exact material. So if I had showed up and just said, I want a 55D polyurethane go, that design may not have been manufacturable. So I think there's a balance to, what is truly critical at your design stage, what can't be changed? And then what are all these other things that are still a little bit amorphous, and working with your manufacturer on how to optimize all the things in parallel? Because as soon as you nail one down, if you haven't considered all the other design parameters, you might have eliminated an option for something else.
Yeah, that's a great
No,
point.
that's a great point.
I'll add to that briefly
for it,
as
yeah.
well as, Adrian, you bring up a great point, and I would say you can go the other way too. And I've had companies come to me and say, well, what material do you want? And they're just like, I don't know. We just want something that's kind of soft. And it's like, okay, you can go both ways. So I think, yeah, it can definitely be like, don't, be careful about saying we're going to go this way right away without contracting, going and talking to a manufacturer, but also be willing to give some input there, and just, don't be too flexible, like almost in some regards, because that's not helpful either.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So this principle of going to a manufacturer, and of course this applies to a company like Rose, it applies to any good manufacturer. If you understand what all the bins are that are gonna have to be addressed, right? All the different things that are gonna have to be addressed. What kind of surface finish do you want? What kind of material are you looking for? As much as you do or don't know about it, either over specifying it or under specifying it. If you know it's truly a requirement and it has to be this material somehow, well, then maybe it truly is a requirement. But yeah, so many companies are motivated to put things down when it's not, they don't actually know that they need it. Sure. Or they fail to address the category entirely. So I think it's really important coming in the door. It sounds like the way that Adrian lined it up and you confirmed is, let's get all these buckets. Let's make sure we're talking about all these buckets. Let's understand which ones are true requirements and which ones have flexibility in them. Now we can have that conversation. Now we can have a healthy relationship on the technical details.
Yep.
That's great. Chris, I know you've got some thoughts on DFM topics. So now we're in conversation with the manufacturer like Rose. We're talking about some of these things. What are some of the, oh, look at this. We've even got a slide, 4 mistakes commonly made by medical device designers and startup companies. I love it. What are the headaches that you get brought?
Yeah. And some of these things are very generic, and maybe you guys have touched on them in past weeks as well. But the number one thing is simply not understanding your industry very well. I think that's kind of well, obviously, if you're going to go into business and something, you need to understand the industry. But I think a lot of people don't realize how special the medical device industry is and some of the requirements that it has, especially from a regulatory standpoint. And so they kind of underestimate things when they go into it. And you kind of touched on, the first point there, which is, do you have any idea what your validation or regulatory path is going to be for this device? I think a lot of companies go into it and they don't really know what they're doing or what that path even looks like. They want to make this device, but they have no idea how to get from where they are today to where they need to be or want to be, which is selling this device out on the market. And so I would just encourage a lot of companies to, at least early on, start outlining that strategy. It does not need to be a full validation strategy. I'm not saying that you need to know every step of the way from day one, but this can be something that you can add detail to as you hit milestones. Okay, well, we figured out this portion of the design. Now let's circle back around. Does everything that we laid out in our validation strategy still make sense? Do we need to pivot? Do we need to adjust? So I think that's a big thing, is just have an understanding there.
That was pause you right there on that one, because the word validation gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, as we've talked on the show many times, has a very specific meaning in the med device industry. But there's even more under the hood, and maybe you can touch on this briefly, both you and Adrian. In terms of validation, you really can't validate a product without manufacturing involved. You need production representative materials to do it. What does that tend to look like for Rose when a company is out there saying, okay, it's time to validate our product, which for the regulatory world means you're comparing it to your intended use and your user needs to make sure that the finished product meets those?
Yeah.
What does that look like on the ground for you? What kinds of things are you getting asked to do, or should you be getting asked to do?
Sure. Yeah. And I will tell you that it is highly, highly variable based on the companies that we're working with. Our quality system is designed around what our customers require us to do, simply because there is almost no normal. There is within some regard, But we've had some companies that literally tell us, we don't know, just do whatever you normally do, which is a big no-no. And then we have other companies that have extremely specific requirements, and they know exactly what they are going to require us to do. So, but just generically, at the beginning, we like to lay down a master validation plan with a customer. And that's a way for us to communicate at the beginning that roadmap that we were just talking about on the manufacturing side of the business. So this is our plan of not necessarily every little detail of how we're going to validate this, but we've reviewed your design, and these are the areas that we think are critical and that we need to control, that we need to qualify. And now we're going to go do that. And that's kind of a way for us to really make sure that at the very beginning, we're aligned with expectations. The customer feels like they're checking all the boxes that they need for their regulatory requirements. And we feel like we have a strong understanding of what the customer is expecting us to do, so that we don't get to the end of the path and they say, well, wait a minute, you didn't do these 4 things that I was expecting you to do. So that's a really big piece of it, is a master validation plan. Just kind of lays everything out on the table for the customer at the beginning. And it also gives you a great way to circle back at the end and say, yes, now we've done all of the things that we said we were going to do at the beginning, and it's all complete and we're ready to go. So there's, obviously there's a lot of IQ, OQ, PQ that goes into that. Those are very much daily terms in validation world, as far as checking on your tooling, making sure your processing window is good, and then proving that your process is consistent. Big pieces of it. And then depending on the customer, they may or may not want to push into sub-tier qualification. So wanting to push into, well, what are your suppliers doing? What do their processes look like? It's all risk-based, of course. You're very familiar with that stuff, but risk is a huge part of that. And without, spending the whole rest of the day talking about process validation, that's kind of my 10,000-foot view of it. So.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously, it's, as we've talked many times on the show, it's the responsibility of the startup. It's the responsibility of the company taking the product to market, to understand and own their quality system, which includes how are they going to do things like validation. You guys can contribute to that discussion immensely, but ultimately falls to them.
Yep. And the next point I have, it kind of goes along with that, is just knowing actual costs to get to market. A lot of companies really don't take a lot of time to think about this, and they kind of have their rose-colored glasses on when they look at this and when they're doing business planning. And what we were just talking about, that validation cost gets overlooked. It can sometimes be an extremely expensive portion of the path to market. And so if you don't even have that first part, that validation regulatory path, you're going to be in for a huge surprise when you haven't planned for those costs and they come around and hit you in terms of, when I'm doing IQ, OQ, PQ on your processes, we're not covering those costs. That's, part of the process for your device. So we're expecting a customer to cover all of those costs to qualify that here in our manufacturing facility. And so some startups especially kind of get caught off guard by that, and they don't realize all of a sudden they start seeing these large quoted numbers come in for these validation processes, and they're caught very off guard. So that can be something that surprises some people, and they don't understand those requirements.
We actually have an audience question to that end here from Ken. Does Rose assume responsibility for all FDA requirements for documentation, testing, audits if they take on an FDA, I'll say, cleared device? And of course, the answer you're giving here is no, it's the company's responsibility. Although maybe one portion of that that's worth asking is audits, because eventually the company gets an FDA audit, FDA comes and audits Rose. Back up one step there, though. How would you answer that question? Does Rose assume all responsibility for the requirements for documentation, testing, audits, et cetera? What do you guys include when you quote something?
No, that's a fantastic question. We assume responsibility from the standpoint of that we're an ISO certified company. So we're ISO 13485 certified. We have a quality system that ensures that all of our requirements or all of our quality systems meet the requirements of the ISO and the FDA guidelines, and all the manufacturing that we're doing is within that. And we quite frankly, welcome customers to come in and audit us and see what's going on, because you come here, you can see the manufacturing process for yourself. We can walk through the quality documents. You can actually get an understanding of what quality controls we have in place on a production basis. You're correct, though. At the end of the day, the FDA is going to knock on the customer's door, not our door first. And especially if there's something that's wrong with the device, they're not going to come looking at us. They're going to go talk to the customer and say, hey, there's these problems and we need to talk about them. We certainly will get pulled into those discussions. A lot of times during FDA audits, we'll get pulled in, hey, can you send us quality records from batches A, B, and C? And certainly have documentation to support customers through those activities and auditing activities. But yeah, end of the day, the buck stops with the customer.
It's a really important point, because I think there are some manufacturers who, especially in maybe less niche areas than catheters and cannulas, say, hey, I've got a manufacturing floor, I can put things together. Sometimes they will offer to do more of the compliance activities. Another question here: if you take over manufacturing, do end users like hospital systems or DoD order directly from Rose? And a company specialized like Rose is, no, you guys are a service provider. You're doing the manufacturing. It's up to the company and other participants to do that.
Yeah.
We had another question here. Does Rose Medical provide any lost core or dissolvable core dip molding technology for complex shaped balloons? Well, that's a real DFM question. So
that's a great question.
Maybe we'll take that now. It's a good one.
Yeah. That's not something that we have done in the past, but I would love to try something like that. That'd be a lot of fun. Almost like a sand casting, and something along those lines. But no, that's not something we have done, but that would be a really interesting project to get into. I'd love to learn more about that.
Reverse sand casting. I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll make sure we get the contact information up there, and Chris, you can stick it in the chat as well, or if you have it on the slide, that's great too. So the attendee there can follow up with you.
Okay.
Great. We'll let you keep going with us unless Adrian has any comments at this point as well.
Okay.
Actually, as long as we're touching on the concept of dip molding, one of the things that our audience will remember from discussions about injection molding is how you don't have the freedom to change materials once you've cut your mold, because, or at least you only can within a window, because of the differing shrink rates of the material involved. Yep. It sounds sort of like what you're saying, though. Dip molding, you've got some ability to change your material.
Certainly from an earlier on standpoint, from a prototyping standpoint, one of the hard parts about injection molding is it can be very difficult to inexpensively and quickly prototype things. That's really why 3D printers exist, because there's not a great way to actually injection mold something quickly and cheaply a lot of times. So with dip molding, it's much easier. You're molding around some sort of geometry that's not a lost geometry typically, and so it's very easy for us to try different solutions of different materials and form those parts. Now, what you're typically locked into with the dip molding process is the stretch ratio of the material in order to get it off of the forming mandrel. So you may be limited there. You may have some materials that have they can stretch and get off of a mandrel without deforming. And then if you want to try another material, your expansion ratio is too large and you can't get it off basically without damaging the parts. But in general, yes, it's easier to do it that way.
Very cool. Well, this is mistake one. What's mistake two?
Well, one thing I was gonna say, moving forward.
Oh, still mistake one. Okay.
No, just talking about how to avoid the mistake, and I was gonna shamelessly plug you guys into that.
Oh no.
You didn't even have to pay me to say that, but really, as a contract manufacturer, when somebody like Into Being is involved, it helps us gain a lot of confidence that somebody has a better understanding of the industry. We've been approached by a lot of people who may have a great idea, but simply have no understanding of how to take that idea and actually turn it into a product. So working with a design house like Into Being has been a great experience in the past for us and really helped with some of those heartaches. But I would say the second mistake that we see a lot is people who are freezing designs too early. We have the understanding that a lot of companies and startups really want to get to market as fast as possible and spend as little as money as possible. Of course, they're working on a tight budget and tight timelines. But I was always taught in engineering school that you've got the three things: time, money, and quality, and you can pick two of them. So if you're going to go fast and not spend very much money, you can tell quality is going to suffer dramatically. And so that's a big thing that I would say people do too often is, great, looks good, we like the benchtop prototypes, we're freezing the design, moving on, without ever circling back around and improving. And one reason why, especially in medical device, why that causes so much heartache is that the regulatory requirements are making it harder and harder to change the processes after you've gone through that testing and that qualification. So we understand customers are eager to move into the next phase of the process, and they want to get out and they want to be selling product as quickly as possible. But we also want to pump the brakes a lot of times and just tell them, this is going to be really hard to change later down the road, or at least expensive at the very least. So make sure you spend some time doing it right the first time. And that kind of leads into that last part. We see a lot of customers that never have time to do it right, but they always have time to do it twice. And they don't understand the costs, both from a time and a money standpoint, of trying to just blow through something. No, we'll fix that later. Don't worry about it right now. We're just going to move forward. Hey, you have a 4-week option and an 8-week option. We really want you to do the 8-week option because we think it's going to significantly improve things. We don't have time for that. We're going to do the 4-week option. Well, you get to the end of that and everything blows up in your face and you're starting over and doing the 8-week option, except now your total timeline is 12 weeks and you've paid for both options. It happens all the time with customers, and not always, but a lot. So I think the big way that companies can avoid that is just keeping a list of what we call the low-hanging fruit on their projects. A lot of engineers have a list of, like, these are the things I would love to fix about this design. We have that. All my process engineers that sit out there have that with their projects, where they're like, I would be so happy if my customer would just let me change A, B, and C about either my design, or not even the design, the manufacturing process, but we're locked into this and we have to deal with this bad process going on. I understand companies don't always have time or money to fix things right now, but I would just encourage you, keep a list of, like, these are the things that when we have time, we're going to circle back on them, and then actually circle back on them when you get to that point. And then the other thing is to just budget time and money for process iteration. I mean, again, a lot of customers are focused on the design. It needs to be functional. I totally understand that. But they don't, as soon as they get those prototypes in that look good and are functional, they're ready to go. And boom, they want to move. And it's like, we just had somebody make these parts in the lab for the first time. We're not ready to start making hundreds or thousands of these parts tomorrow. There's a long way to go there. And people struggle to understand why or what's causing that. But there's training that needs to happen. We need to build up tooling and those sorts of things. They just don't quite understand that. I actually had one time, somebody went the complete opposite there, and I was shocked when this happened. Had a customer that, we were working on a development project for them, and a purchase order came in for 3 builds of 200 parts. And I said, I called them up and I said, I wasn't expecting this PO. What's this about? Is there another qualification that we need to do? And they just said, no, there's no qualification work that needs to be done, but we're going to be heading into PQ soon, and you guys need to be better at building these parts. So I want you to go out there and I want you to do 3 runs with different operators. I want you to get your operators good at these processes, and then show me training records that actually shows that they know how to build the parts. So when we go into PQ, I have confidence that we're good to go. And my jaw dropped, because nobody had ever done that before, where they had actually been concerned about us being prepared to make parts in a PQ setting. So many guys are just check the minimum boxes, get through PQ and be done. And that was quite an experience. And it helped huge in the end of the game, because now I had operators in the clean room that had actual experience making the products before we went to qualify the processes, which sounds like, well, obviously you want to have that, but so many companies overlook that and don't do that step. It's just so helpful. Not practical for everybody, I understand. It costs money, but it was incredibly helpful in that particular scenario.
That's huge. We often find ourselves telling people, make more parts than you think you need. There's a bunch of reasons that you might need them, but you're gonna wish you had them down the road.
Yeah.
What I want to do, we're nearly at the top of the hour. I recognize that much of our audience has to depart at 3. What I want to do though is I want to keep going for about another 10 minutes for those who can stick around, and also for the recording, because someone's going to come back and they're going to listen to this and they're going to say there were 2 more points. I wanted to hear them. I'm interested in making catheters. I want to call Rose, but I wanted to hear what all the points were. But what I want to do before that is I want to give just a second in case the audience has any questions up to this point. If there's somebody who has to run at the 3 o'clock hour here, to make sure that they can get out, I'll just give one little pause here. If anyone has a question, raise your hand or type it into the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to knock that in here while we have just a second. And other than that, I want Chris to keep going here and get us through the other two mistakes.
Yeah, let me know if you want to pause for a minute or 2 here yet, or
not seeing any right now. So they've been coming in as we've been talking. So we'll keep going.
Well, if anything pops up, just stop me and we can pause and answer questions. So, all right. So the next one that we see often is startups or small companies that want to act like a big company. There's a lot of things that big companies do well, and there's a lot of things that they don't do well. So I think really one thing that we love doing when we're working with startups is just their ability to go quickly and to change direction on a dime and try something else. And so too many companies want to act like the Medtronics or the Abbotts or whatever, and they want to act like it's like, hey, you guys got 20 employees. I know you do. And, we should be able to move more quickly than this. I would say use your size to your advantage, your ability to make decisions quickly, your ability to pivot quickly. Those are big things. I've seen companies that are small that say they want to have 3 signatures on an IQ protocol for a gauge pin. And it's just like, man, what are you guys doing? That's no. Or we're routing this through our purchasing department is another one I get. And it's like, I know there's 3 of you there. So you're sitting that you're the guy that's the purchasing department, or that you're sitting right next to him. So, they're like, hey, can you get started on this right away? I need to go through and get this approved by our purchasing department. And they just let the red tape hold them back so much. So I just want to encourage, use the fact that you're a startup to your advantage. Don't get bogged down by this little stuff. And as far as avoiding that goes, I think a big part of this is making sure that you have quality and regulatory people who are invested in solutions, not just finding problems. For a long time, I think the medical device industry struggled with this policeman mentality with quality people who really wanted to go around and blow the whistle every time they found a problem and then just dump it in somebody else's lap and say, you guys figure it out. I'm seeing less of that, I'll say. Where these quality people are genuinely learning how to be helpful, how to help with the process, how to avoid problems, and then also how to be helpful and find real solutions to the problems. And finding solutions too, that I'll say add value. That's a phrase we use all the time here at Rose is, how does this add value to the company? So we might have a quality problem. That's an opportunity for us to fix a quality problem, but also to add value to the process. Don't just say, well, we're going to 100% inspect it and then it'll be fine after that. What can you do to actually make sure that the process is better? Not just, well, we're going to inspect it and whatever that is. Something we deal with all the time. And along with that is build a company. You want systems that are going to work and be effective for you and your size. A lot of guys are like, yeah, I used to work at, Abbott or St. Jude or whatever. And they try to bring those quality systems or those purchasing systems into that because that worked great for them when they worked for a global entity that had 25 locations. But again, you're a small company and use that to your advantage because that can kind of be your superpower if you know how to use it and do it well. The last thing is probably a bit of a shameless plug for Rose, but making sure that you engage with a contract manufacturer early enough in the process. And this kind of goes along with one of the things that you said earlier, Gene, too, which is, the worst we're going to say is no. We might say, hey, it's a little too early for us to get involved at this point, which is kind of what you alluded to with the no quoting early on. It shows that maybe you've engaged too early. We'll come and see it all the time where somebody comes to us and, well, no, we don't have any drawings or specifications. We just kind of want something like this. Can you make that? And they don't understand the industry. And so they're engaging, a little too early. But I would say a lot of times we get it the other way too, where a customer says, hey, we've got all these requirements. We know exactly what we want. Boom, can you just make this part? And they haven't included any design for manufacturing. And so they get frustrated because they have a design and they just want to go. And we're spending a lot of time asking, well, can you change this? Could you change that? Could you change that? And they don't understand that we're trying to help them. We're trying to make them understand where their design could be improved to make it easier to build so that it's not a headache for us to make it in our clean rooms. And so that can be a process that is tough for some people to go through. I would say too, that a lot of companies, this is really DFM here. You're designing a part solely for function and not for manufacturing. This should really be a collaboration between the manufacturer and the designer. And Gene, you touched on this earlier, and I thought that was perfect, which is you want to find those places where the design can bend and improve the manufacturing. But at the same time, you also want to hold fast on those things that are critical. This part needs to be exactly this inside diameter, and that tolerance is real and it needs to be held because of these reasons. When we hear that, it's like, okay, we know that, boom, that's critical. Because a lot of our time early on is spent kind of probing and figuring out, all right, what do you actually need here? And what did you just throw on the drawing because you wanted to put a dimension there and it's not actually critical? And kind of that collaboration and back and forth is really important. We're trying to save people a lot of money and heartache down the road. But at the same time, we appreciate that at times it just needs to be what it needs to be. And so hold hard on the things that need to be and be willing to flex on the things that you don't actually need that plus or minus 1/1000th of an inch on.
And oftentimes a company doesn't know what they actually need until they've tried it and put it into a bench model or put it into animals or put it into people. And that's when that information comes out. Those are great examples. And in fact, I was wondering about one illustrative one that you brought up earlier. You said that companies often don't have time to do it right. They've got time to do it twice. And our audience has often heard us talk about the iterative nature of development.
Yeah.
But I remember a vendor that I used to work with way back in the day at a long time ago, so 20 years ago now. And he would always look at me when I was a design engineer and he would say, are you sure you want me to polish the molds, Gene? It's going to take, this long and it's going to cost this much. You don't even know if these parts are going to work yet. Are you sure you want me to polish that mold? And of course, I'm sitting in a management meeting or something going, well, of course we want to polish the mold. We want it done soon. And what he was saying to me was, hold on, you can check it now. You can salvage this. There's changes you can make that are actually going to set you ahead of the curve, not behind it. But I wonder, and ask you both to reflect on this from a design perspective and from a manufacturing perspective. What are some things in the world of catheters where historically it makes sense to hold up? We'll do that aspect a little bit later in the process when we're sure we've got the right product and the right design. What are some places where historically you could have run ahead, you could have spent the extra 4 weeks and the extra money, but maybe better pause, maybe better not be overconfident? Are there some consistent examples of that kind of a principle?
That's a challenging question. Adrian, do you have any examples that come to mind there?
It is a challenging question because I was trying to think of ones where I've kicked the can down the road and then decide whether or not that was the right thing to do. I recently did it with radio peg banding. I thought every catheter has RO bands. I can get some RO bands in this catheter. The complexity of the design, the way the design was done, the post-processing that had to be done, like in the tipping, all this sort of stuff made that RO banding process not just a standard traditional thing, you know, and we're working in the cutting edge of innovation. Even though something is done on every single catheter, it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to do on yours. So I almost want to do the opposite and say, you know, be flexible, but don't let anything fall off out of the buckets too early. Like, have it on everybody's brain. Like, eventually this is going to need an RO band.
Yeah.
But we don't know how we're going to do it yet. But don't forget and wait till the end to have to do it.
Sure.
That's a great point. It's kind of a low-hanging fruit list again, but applied not just to, oh, we've got the thing on the market now and there's some things we'd like to do down the road, but rather on the actual design features. Like, yeah, we can talk about where they go in the process, but don't forget they have to be there. That's a great point, Adrian. Any thoughts, Chris?
I don't have anything to add. That was a good example.
That was a great example. Well, I appreciate that. There's the list of mistakes that Chris has brought to us. This is really cool, and I just have to overemphasize that building catheters is very different than building a lot of other things. I mean, yes, there's similarities, but really an important niche. Really cool that we have in the state of Michigan a company like Rose that can do this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, we've obviously, we don't have any formal relationships. We've worked together and we've always appreciated you guys. So
yep.
Can't tell you how much that means. And
Likewise.
Coming on today to talk about some of these things with us.
Yep. Yeah, it's been great. And I appreciate you guys reaching out. It's been a great relationship. We really appreciated working with you on a couple of different projects. And I think it's been mutually beneficial.
Chris, how can folks get in touch with you?
That's a great point. I'd be happy to throw out my contact information in the chat for everybody. But the biggest thing is rosemedical.com or just email us info@rosemedical.com, info, and that'll go right into an inbox that forwards on to me and also our inside sales engineer. We can certainly have conversations with you guys about anything that you're working on or what you're struggling with or how we can help.
Well, that's great. We really appreciate you being here today, Chris. Hope you and everyone else on the call has a great weekend. We are so thankful for everyone's participation, and thanks for going over a little bit with us today. It was definitely well worth it. We appreciate your time, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Adrian, thank you for being here as always. Amazing work and amazing knowledge there. So we appreciate you.
Thanks.
And thank you all for being here today. We'll look forward to the next episode of MedTech Crossroads. We'll be starting the month of September with the pitch party next week. Looking forward to it. Talk soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.